Claudia left on a Friday. Her best friend Mara was the one who helped her pack. They were at my apartment for 3 hours. I was not there. I had made myself not be there. Because there are some things you do not need to watch. And when I came home, the closet had gaps in it, and the shelf above the bathroom sink had gaps in it, and there was a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I'm sorry, C," in Claudia's handwriting, which told me everything about what the note was not going to explain. I called the only person I could think of, which was my friend Theo. And Theo came over and sat with me for 2 hours and then had to leave because he had a morning shift. And I sat alone in the apartment with the gaps until about midnight. My phone buzzed at 12:07. It was Mara. The text said, "I know this is strange. Are you okay?" I stared at it for a long time. Then I typed, "Not really. You?" She said, "Also not really. She's my best friend and I love her. But I've been sitting in my car for an hour because I didn't know where else to go." That was where it started. Not the ending, the starting. With 2 people sitting separately in the wreckage of someone else's exit, texting each other at midnight because neither of them had anywhere better to be. My name is Reed Callahan. I'm 34. I manage operations for a mid-size event production company, which means I spend my professional life making sure that complicated things with a lot of moving parts happen in the right order at the right time, and that when they don't, nobody in the audience knows. I am good at this. I am considerably less good at the personal equivalent, as evidenced by the gaps in my closet and the note that said, "I'm sorry," without saying what for. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in a city that is the right size, big enough to disappear in if you need to, small enough to keep running into the same people. I had been with Claudia Reyes for 2 years. I had liked Mara Reyes, her older sister by proximity, if not by blood, for approximately as long as I had known either of them, which I had filed under irrelevant and kept there with some effort. I need to tell you about Mara. She is 33. She works in urban planning. She thinks about how cities grow and where the pressure points are and what happens to the people in between when something changes around them without asking. She has the kind of mind that finds the structural logic in things that look like chaos, which made her professionally excellent and personally sometimes difficult to outmaneuver in an argument. She had been Claudia's best friend since they were 19 and inseparable since 22, which meant she had been in my peripheral vision for 2 years as someone who was warm and specific, and occasionally said things that made me think about them for the rest of the day, which I had also filed under irrelevant and kept there with considerable effort. She was the maid of honor at a wedding we all attended 8 months before Claudia left. I sat next to her at the dinner because the seating chart put us together, and we talked for 4 hours. And I drove home afterward with the specific unsettled feeling of a conversation that has asked you questions you didn't know you had. I did not examine this. I filed it. I am, I recognize now, an aggressive filer. Mara and I texted that night until 2 in the morning. Not about Claudia, mostly. About the particular loneliness of midnight when something has just ended. About whether grief was the right word for the end of something that had been fading for longer than either of us had said out loud. About the fact that she had been in my apartment a dozen times over 2 years and had always left with Claudia, and this was the first time she had ever texted me alone. She said, "I always thought you were the most reasonable person in Claudia's life," which is not a small thing. Claudia does not collect reasonable people. I said, "She collected you." She said, "I'm not reasonable. I just hide it better." I said, "That sounds like a reasonable thing to say." She sent back a single character, a period, which I have since learned is her version of, "You're not wrong," and I'm not going to reward that with a full response. We did not see each other for 6 weeks after that. I thought about her more than I thought about Claudia, which I recognized as information and chose not to do anything with. I had a loose policy in those weeks of not doing anything with information. I was in the gap in the closet phase of things, and I thought it was important to stay there long enough to actually leave it. She texted at the 6-week mark. She said, "There is a farmer's market near my office on Saturdays. It has excellent coffee and a man who sells only hot sauce, who I think is having the time of his life. I am going this Saturday. You can come if you want. No agenda." I said, "What counts as an agenda?" She said, "Anything we have to discuss. This is not that." I said, "Okay." She said, 10 o'clock. I'll be the one buying unnecessary hot sauce. The farmer's market was exactly what she described. Small, serious about itself. The kind that has more vegetables than crafts and takes both equally seriously. She was already there when I arrived, which I registered, holding a coffee in each hand, which I also registered. She handed me one without ceremony and said, "The hot sauce man is over there. I've already committed to 2 bottles on your behalf. We're going after the tomatoes." I said, "I don't remember agreeing to hot sauce." She said, "You agreed to no agenda. Hot sauce is outside the scope of agenda." I said, "That's not how scope works." She said, "I'm in urban planning. I decide what's in scope." I followed her to the tomatoes. This seemed like the reasonable response. We were there for 2 hours. She knew things about the vendors, which ones had been there since the beginning, which one had expanded from a single table to 3 over 5 years, where the pressure points were in the layout and why certain spots got more foot traffic than others. She noticed things the way she noticed everything, which was with a completeness that didn't announce itself, just arrived in what she said. I noticed her noticing. She asked how I was once, and it was the real question. I said I was better than 6 weeks ago and not as good as I intended to be in 6 more weeks, and she said that sounded like a plan rather than an answer. And I said it was both, and she said fair. I asked how Claudia was. She paused for just a moment, small, deliberate, and said, "She's okay. She's Claudia. She lands on her feet." She looked at the tomatoes. "She doesn't talk about it much. You know how she is." I said I did. Mara said, "She asked me not to." She stopped, started again. "She asked me to be careful." I said, "About what?" She looked at me. Direct the way she is about things she has decided to be direct about. She said, "About this. About seeing you." I held her gaze for a moment. Then I looked at the tomatoes. I said, "What did you say?" She said, "I said I was going to the farmer's market, and she was welcome to have feelings about that." A pause. She said she thought I would say something like that. I said, "Is that the whole conversation?" She picked up a tomato, turned it over in her hand, set it down. She said something else. "I've been deciding whether to tell you." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know." She picked up another tomato, this one better, put it in the bag. She said, "And I want you to understand that Claudia says things and means them in a way that is particular to Claudia, and that she said this without cruelty and without—" She paused again, finding the words, which she does not do often. She said, "You always knew you'd end up with him. So I suppose I should stop being surprised you're going to the farmer's market." The sentence landed in the specific quiet of a Saturday morning, between tomatoes and the smell of coffee, and the sound of the hot sauce man explaining something enthusiastically to a new customer. I said, "She said that." Mara said, "She said that." I said, "Did you know?" She was quiet for a long moment. She set the tomato bag down. She looked at me with the expression she has when she is deciding how honest to be, which is always the expression right before she is completely honest, because she always decides to be. She said, I knew something. I didn't have a word for it. I was very careful not to find one. I said, how long? She said, a while. I said, the wedding? She said very quietly, before the wedding. Something in the air between us changed, not dramatically, no weather event, just a small shift in pressure. The way a room changes when a window is opened that has been closed for a long time. I said, Mara. She said, I know. I said, I'm not going to say anything else right now. She said, I know that too. I said, because I think if I say the thing I'm thinking right now, on a Saturday morning at a farmer's market 6 weeks after a relationship ended, that is the wrong order of operations. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, you're very careful. I said, I'm in event production. I think about order of operations. She said, I know. I've always... She stopped, picked up the tomato bag. I've always liked that about you. She held my gaze. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. I took 4 months. I am aware this is longer than 11 days, and I say this without comparison. Different people, different architectures, different amounts of structural assessment required. I was careful because being careful was the only thing that felt honest, and because Mara deserved honesty more than she deserved speed. I went to the farmer's market 3 more times in those 4 months. Always Saturday. Always coffee already in her hands when I arrived, which I eventually understood was not incidental. We talked about her work and mine, about the city and its pressure points, about books she was reading and whether I had opinions about them, which she asked not because she needed my opinions, but because she was interested in how I had them. The hot sauce man became a recurring character. I bought 4 bottles. I do not need this much hot sauce. I am not sorry. At no point did either of us name what we were doing. At no point did either of us need to. The 5th Saturday, in November, she was not at the tomatoes when I arrived. She was standing by the coffee cart with 2 cups, looking at her phone. And when she looked up, she looked, I want to get this right, like a person who has been patient for a long time and has decided that today is the day she is done being patient. Not aggressive, not impatient, just decided. She handed me the coffee. She said, I have something to say. I said, okay. She said, I have been going to a farmer's market on Saturdays for several years. I have, in that time, never invited anyone. I do not like company at the farmer's market in general. I find it slows down the tomato process. She held her coffee with both hands. I invited you the first time because I wanted to see how you were. I invited you the second time because I wanted to see you. I have invited you every time since because I want you here. On Saturdays. At this market. She looked at me steadily. I thought you should know that the distinction exists. That sentence. I will keep that sentence for a long time. I said, I know the distinction. She said, I thought you might. I said, I've been thinking about order of operations. She said, I know. You're in event production. I said, the order is, tell you that I have been looking forward to Saturdays in a way that has nothing to do with the tomatoes or the hot sauce or the structural logic of the market layout, and everything to do with the person who already has the coffee when I get here. She looked at me for a moment. Something in her face did the thing that faces do when they let go of something they have been holding carefully for a long time. Not relief exactly. More like the particular ease of a thing finally being put down after a long carry. She said, she was right, you know. I said, which part? She said, the part where she said, I always knew. I said, did you? She looked at her coffee, then at me. She said, I knew something that I didn't have a word for. I was very careful not to find one. She paused. I found one now. I said, What is it? She said, You. The hot sauce man was explaining something to someone 3 stalls over. The tomato vendor was making change. The city was doing what cities do on Saturday mornings in November, which is exist in that gray gold way that makes ordinary things look considered. I reached over and took the coffee out of her hand, just for a moment, just long enough. And I kissed her once, in the middle of the farmer's market, between the tomatoes and the hot sauce and the excellent city light. And she put her hand briefly against my face the way you touch something you have been waiting to touch for longer than is reasonable. And then she took her coffee back and said, You can buy your own next week. I said, You'll already have it. She said, Probably. She didn't even try to hide the smile. I called Claudia 3 months later. It was the right thing to do, and I had been waiting until I was sure enough of my own footing to do it, without it being about my footing. She answered on the 3rd ring. I said I wanted her to hear it from me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mara told me. Another pause. She called me first, before anything happened. She called me and she said, she told me what she was going to do, and she asked if I was going to be okay. I said, What did you say? Claudia said, I said yes, eventually. A breath. I said I'd always known, and she said she'd always known too. And we cried for about 15 minutes, and then I told her to go buy good tomatoes. She paused. Reed. She called me first. I said, I know. She said, Take care of her. I said I would. A year later, when Mara's mother asked how we got together, Mara said, A farmer's market. He kept coming back for the hot sauce. Her mother said, There must have been something else. Mara said, There was. He figured out the order of operations. Her mother looked at me. I said, She already had the coffee. Her mother looked between us for a moment and then said, with the satisfaction of someone who recognizes a thing that has been true for longer than it has been named, Yes. I imagine she did. Claudia was at the wedding. She was, as she always is, exactly herself. Warm where it was easy and careful where it wasn't. And genuinely glad in the way that only old friends can be glad for each other, which is with full knowledge of the cost. She hugged Mara for a long time before the ceremony. I do not know what was said. I do not need to. Some things have been true longer than they've been spoken. The best ones usually have. What would you have done if the person you were supposed to move on from turned out to be the wrong person, and the right one had been there the whole time, already holding the coffee? And have you ever known something for a long time without a word for it, and then suddenly found the word? Tell me in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.